Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, Mrs. Minnie Wright is guilty in the midst of her accused murder. Evidence stacks very clearly against her, and the circumstances of Mr. Wright's death all point to a clear focal point: his wife. Murders are, in almost all cases, subsequent results of motives. Mrs. Wright had every motive to kill her husband after the years of domestic abuse she faced from him. Mrs. Peters states, "What was needed for the case was a motive, something to show anger, or sudden feeling." Mrs. Hale knew very well her neighbors. She knew their work ethic, their standards, and their personalities. Although she hasn't visited the home in over a year, she is well acquainted with both John and Minnie. Mrs. Hale states the following of John: "He didn't drink, and he kept his word as well as most, I guess, and paid his debts. But he was a hard man." She shivered as she stated that, like a raw wind that gets to the bone. If Mrs. Hale felt the harshness of John Wright, imagine the hell Mrs. Wright had to live with behind closed doors. Mrs. Wright experienced her breaking point as she watched John snap the neck of her beloved canary. The cage door was ripped open in sudden and brute force, as observed by Mrs. Hale and Mrs. Peters. The bird was found gently wrapped in silk with a wooden box, with its head turned to a side angle. It had to have been prepared to be buried. This was what caused Mrs. Wright to snap and act in aggression. Nothing held her back. An eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, and a neck for a neck. Mrs. Peters makes a powerful declaration about the feelings that perhaps Minnie felt as she watched her canary die. Mrs. Peters relates herself with this experience. "When I was a girl, my kitten, there was a boy that took a hatchet, and before my eyes, and before I could get there, if they hadn't held me back, I would hurt him." Mrs. Wright had no one to hold her back, no children, no friends, no neighbors visiting. The admiration of the bird was shown through the tightness of its presentation in its small box. Mrs. Hale knew that Mrs. Wright was a tidy person, as all farm wives are. As such, we see how Mrs. Wright's motives were set in stone, as her beloved canary was killed by her domestic abuser. Furthermore, the manner of the murder could in no way be committed by none other than Mrs. Wright. After 2 inspections of the upstairs bedroom, one by the sheriff and another by the sheriff and the county attorney, there is no evidence that others were in the bedroom at the time of the murder. There was no forced entry. The rope that was used was owned by the Wrights, and no one else had reason to visit the Wrights that night. Mrs. Wright claims that she slept through the strangling of her husband as she slept inches from him. "I didn't wake up. I slept sound." As a man gets strangled, he fights with every last whit of energy in his fiber to keep alive. A man can contort, kick, flare the arms, struggle, etc. to free himself from his strangler's grasp. Mr. Wright was not a man to simply let someone choke him with no struggle. As such, his movements and struggles would have been so violent and rapid that Mrs. Wright would have had to woken up. Not even the soundest of sleepers are able to dream while a man inches away from him is strangled on the same bed. It is impossible. After all is said and done, this is truly a sad story. Simply, a domestically abused woman could no longer take the psychological stress imposed by her abusing husband. Such circumstances can lead people to do extreme things, and as such, we find Minnie Wright guilty of the murder of John Wright.